All right, let's talk about an issue that is increasingly important for Christians to address today. The idea is that immorality or immoral conduct is that which harms another person, period. How do you respond to that idea?
Well, I have harm assumes some definition of well-being. And I read a book not too long ago by Stephen Smith called The Disenchantment of Secular Discourse, in which he talks about the fact that the typical statement, which of course is, the only thing that's wrong is if you harm someone or you keep them from realizing their dreams. In other words, if you impinge on their freedom or something like that. And he points out a number of good articles over the years that have said what an empty idea that is. Because, it's, for example, quick example is, does my, or I shouldn't say that because I don't do it, does this person's use of pornography hurt anybody else? Now somebody says, of course not. That's him. He does it in the privacy, doesn't hurt anybody else. But you could argue by his actually buying it, he creates a market for it. That means now my children have it available. Or if you don't, how do you know, for example, are you willing to argue that pornography doesn't hurt him? If it hurts him, he's part of the body politic, he's part of the community. Are you saying that doesn't have any influence on the way in which he deals with people? And people say, no, that's not true. It's not harming anybody. Right away, you can't agree on what well-being is. You can't agree on it, you have different views of human flourishing and human thriving, which are always rooted in, I must say, kind of philosophical and religious assumptions about human nature, and therefore it's an empty idea. And you have to get through it and say, no, come on, what are human beings for? What were we made for? What is our purpose? And then you can start talking about harming somebody, because if a human being has a purpose, and you argue for that and you make your case, then you could say, I'm being harmed because I'm not able to fulfill my purpose. But just to say harm, it's empty.
Well, why in a case like this often comes up with homosexuality, okay? How do two people involved in a homosexual relationship, how do they harm anybody else? Okay, so why is it that we see that and most people think that's not really harm, so it can't be immoral? And yet with adultery, in some cases, there's a sort of harm perhaps, but there's certainly no physical harm necessarily for a man, to the woman, to the wife who's being cheated on. Okay, so why are more people able to see that as being immoral, where there isn't necessarily harm, at least certainly not in a physical sense?
If you don't mind me, I want to reframe it just a little bit. Okay. Because I agree with everything that Tim said. You're spot on. But I want to shake it up a little bit by going back and saying the suggestion that which is immoral is that which causes harm, period, isn't actually wrong. Okay. It's just wrongly applied, because we do believe that every immoral act harms. So if we're going to ask the question, is morality only that which harms, the answer is going to be yes. The problem is you can't just limit it to how it harms me. We're part of a community. As Tim said, we're a part of a civilization. Civilization requires a certain understanding of the human good, human thriving, human flourishing. And there's certain rules that we have to live by if indeed we're going to have the kind of culture, the kind of society that will lead to human thriving. So that means there are all kinds of areas that the law actually will touch and will appropriately even necessarily touch. So when you ask the question, as it's coming to us now, why would a Christian be against same-sex marriage? What harm does a gay couple cause to a heterosexual couple? Well, that's the wrong moral calculus. Let's just say right away, there is no direct causal relationship. You could have the two couples living side by side. There could be no conflict. The problem is, if marriage itself, as it has been understood through human history, is one of those things that is necessary in terms of the monogamous union of a male and a female, which, by the way, if you're not a Christian, let's just say you're a secular sociologist, one of the things you note is that when you have heterosexual married couples, you have, for instance, far greater thriving for children. You have an exponentially greater rate of fathers taking responsibility for their offspring and staying with them through the time of their raising. So in other words, if you're taking the Christian worldview out of it and just say pragmatically what is harmed, well, you're taking an institution that's been central to human thriving, and you're saying we're going to revolutionize that. there are those of us who believe that will come with an inevitable cost, which will mean a harm to the entire society. And Tim got it exactly right when he started talking about the harm that comes to someone that is later on, such as making pornography available. What does someone looking at pornography in a dorm room 1,000 miles from me right now, what harm does that cause me? No direct causal harm. But it establishes a social context in which there is harm not only to me and to those whom I love, but to our responsibility to every citizen of which we're sharing a civilization.
How do you convince someone, though, that that person is harming themselves, in a sense, when they actually see their actions as being fulfilling, as their very liberation? What a Christian would understand as them being enslaved to sin, they understand as their very identity and their very liberation.
Everybody says they're fulfilled. Hitler thought it was fulfilling to kill the Jews.
Okay.
See, that's what I mean
But
by
that
saying
caused harm to other people. See if other people could recognize that.
Well,
So-
no. Listen, what Hitler would say is, he was taking a certain group of people out
Okay.
for the greater good,
Okay.
and so you listen. If the harm is a wax nose, the idea of just harm, we don't want to harm anybody, and then leaving it up to you to define it, it just doesn't work as a moral. As a moral principle.
Now, Tim, to make your point, now just consider, for instance, how our society has changed its mind on the morality of smoking cigarettes.
Sure.
The argument that's being used now is not just that it will harm you, it's that
It
you
will.
are becoming an economic burden to the
Right.
entire society. You're overloading the healthcare system.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've had a shift from, yes, it's just about you and what harm directly, causally is related to you, to, look, this is a civilization and having to pay your bills.
It's
Yeah.
interesting. It seems like, though, there was a recent poll that showed the level of pro-choice Americans has dropped to an kind of all-time low, or at least since Roe v.
Well.
Wade. Okay. Well, the question there is that I think a lot of the headway that's been made by pro-life advocates has been to show how abortion harms women. Okay, there are women who are doing it, or that it's a sign of abuse from others. That it's kind of it's almost like a feminist, a pro-life
But they're
feminist
also showing
argument.
how it harms the agent now visible to us through the ultrasound.
Right. I think it's
Okay.
because of technology. You now see
Okay.
the unborn child, and the unborn child is more real and seems to look like a person. And
Okay.
I actually think that's one of the reasons why
do
people
too.
are having more trouble than ever
Okay.
saying it's just tissue.
Okay, but so we've seen some advance, though, with changing, smoking a good example, but there's a clear example of harm. Okay, with the ultrasound there's harm, but there's also kind of abortion within the context of abuse.
Right.
There's harm, but it's much harder on other sexual issues or other morality issues.
Well,
or-
why is it harder, though? And
Okay.
I'm not arguing that it's not, but it's
Yeah.
only harder because we bought into an idea of autonomous individualism in which we
Right.
say
It's
my sex
naive.
life is only my
Yeah, it's
issue.
naive.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's just
Okay.
naive. Individualism is naive. Everybody knows that you have an impact on other people. So what you do affects you, and then how you live affects other people. And I could see in the future, not that I'm able to do it right now in these couple of minutes right here off the cuff, but I do think you could make cases for the harmful effects of most aspects of traditional Christian morality. I think you could make what you might say would be almost a common sense argument, or at least an argument that would have some persuasiveness to people who don't believe the Bible, that this is harmful to people. I actually do think you can make that case to some degree. I don't believe that the only people who are going to accept what the Bible says about morality are people that accept the authority of the Scripture.
One last point, then. Some Christians will respond to that and say, okay, well, it doesn't harm you don't think, but it harms God. Therefore, it's immoral if it harms God.
Well, it's not appropriate to talk about harming
can't
God.
harm
Right,
God.
But
right. But
let's,
that seems-
let's use the language of Romans chapter 1,
Okay.
and that is to rob God of his glory.
Okay.
And so that's an issue. I would suggest, however, that the most important thing to look at here is the fact that it eventually becomes undeniable that all wrongdoing causes harm. There's a very interesting debate going on right now in Germany, because you have an absolute right in the German Constitution to know your mother and father. It's a very strange, but it's a constitutional principle. Well, then, what about an anonymous sperm donor? So you look at that and you say, well, what difference does that make? Well, the German Constitution is saying that it's a harm to someone not to know who their parents are.
Okay.
All right. Well, would it be a harm to the parents not to have access to the technology? In other words, you can't get around the fact that every act is morally freighted. and that every moral action is going to have consequences, and if that moral action is wrong, it will bring about a harm.
Right. By the way, Michael Sandel, in his great book on justice, Michael Sandel is not a religious believer, but he's got a certain section in there in which he says all justice is judgmental.
That's right.
There's a little section where he says, because he says every construal of justice assumes a view of human nature or a view of right and wrong. It's not empirical. It's not objective. It's based on these beliefs. And everybody has beliefs about what is harmful to human beings based on the idea of what human beings are for.
That's right.
And so it's not a question of us imposing morality on people who just want to be free, because freedom's it's actually an empty concept. And if you look more carefully, people actually do have views of human nature and right and wrong. In spite of the fact they're saying, freedom, my freedom, my freedom, through that they actually also have views of things that they're pressing and pushing, and we have the right, I think, as Christians to come and say, no, that's harmful to human beings, and here's why we think this is the way in which we should be living.
There's a very interesting debate also. For instance, it's about the Ten Commandments.
Okay.
For instance, honor your father and your mother. All right. That commandment is a bit different than all the rest. As a matter of fact, in the New Testament, it's said to be the only commandment that comes with a promise. But you notice how quickly it follows those that directly reference God. If you talk about the two tables here. And so all of a sudden you have honor your father and your mother. So what harm comes to me if miles and miles away from here there is a couple that is raising their children, not disciplining them, the children are not being raised to honor their father and their mother? What harm is it to me? Well, eventually we live in a civilization in which you have no respect for authority, you have no respect for one another, you have no respect for right and wrong, no respect for law. And so it's really interesting when you look at this, like Sandel will also talk about the necessity of virtues. You have to have virtues. He's a communitarian. And so eventually virtues mean laws. Virtues imply if you break the virtue, you violate the virtue, that's immoral.
So maybe one way to get at this issue, again, you guys are raising, is get into that communal aspect of it, because, we're in tension with people who they regard themselves as autonomous individuals, but they want community at the same time. So to show the way that this autonomous individualism is pursued to its purported ends would actually ruin and make community impossible.
Yeah.
Make civilization impossible.
And actually, a lot of people are admitting that at one level.
Okay.
They are admitting it, even though they recognize it's not that easy to. It's not that easy to make the case. Right now, just talking about individual human rights seems to be the only thing that, when you yell about that in the public square, everybody shuts up because it seems self-evidently right.
Okay.
Except thoughtful people, and I'm not talking about just religious believers or Christians. Thoughtful scholars are recognizing that that's an empty claim.
Okay.
It's an empty claim, and we have to figure out what we believe about human flourishing and how you build a human community. And Angelo Delbanco at Columbia, some years ago, wrote a book called "The Real American Dream: A Meditation on Hope," and he talks about the fact that, for roughly speaking, the first grand narrative of American society was God. And then it morphed to nation, that manifest destiny of our nation. And now he says the narrative is self. He goes from God to nation to self. And he admits that this is not enough to build a community on, and it has worked to some degree to create some better conditions for certain oppressed groups of people, without a doubt. But in the end, it's not enough to bind a society together. And he says we're about out of narrative, and what are we going to do about it? So smart people who aren't believers know we have a problem.
Well, that's helpful.
Can I come back on one last thing? We are Christians here, not merely communitarians.
Sure.
And so as Christians, I think what we want to say is that a part of what it means to be a Christian, and certainly a biblical Christian, is to believe that God is well disposed to us.
Sure. Right.
That he loves us, and by his mercy, because he loves us, has given us institutions, laws, and statutes that lead to human flourishing. So what we believe as Christians is that the violation of those laws, regardless of how liberating someone may think that being freed from those laws will be, actually leads to human harm and to a lack of human flourishing.
Right.
And we're not doing that because we're any smarter in the world. We're not holding these positions because we figured them out by our own experience. We have to come back and say, we simply believe that God has revealed these things, and we're not any smarter, but we do understand it's a part of a bigger picture.
Well, I really agree with Al when he says that we're not just communitarians. We can't just talk about the horizontal. And but again, here's one of the here's an argument I've used that actually at least makes a number of secular people think about it. It's Alistair McIntyre's argument that you can't talk about right and wrong unless you talk about purpose. So, for example, here's a watch. Is it a good watch or a bad watch? If I say I hammered a nail with it and it broke, it's a bad watch. You say, but it wasn't made to hammer nails. It's made to sit on your wrist and tell time. And that's how you know if it's a good or bad watch. Unless you know what it's for, you don't know whether it's good or bad. So as soon as we start talking about human flourishing, we talk about what are human beings for. If you say we're here by accident, there is no narrative, there is no purpose, we're just here by accident, he says, then you can just stop talking about right and wrong. Because until you know what a human being is for, the purpose of a human being, you can't talk about what this person is a good or bad human being or a good or bad human action. But the problem then, of course, is you can't not talk about right and wrong, and yet here you are stuck. And that's where I put pressure on my secular friends to say, if you want to say we're here by accident, then there really shouldn't be any way to talk about right and wrong, and yet you know deep down that there is.
Right.
So why not, if your premise that there is no God leads you to a conclusion that you know isn't true, that there's no right and wrong, why not re-examine the premise?
Good idea. Thanks, Tim.